Manassas National Battlefield. And let me just give you a little background on the segment that you just saw. The Maryland Campaign trailer was created to pique the interest of not only those familiar with and interested in the Civil War and the National Park Service, but also those who are not. It gives a glimpse into a mysterious soldier's epic journey through the 6 parks of the Maryland Campaign, and shows the parks in a creative and cinematic light. This could not have happened without the countless hours of Aaron Cook, the star of the trailer, who volunteered for this project. The National Park Service would like to thank him for his enthusiasm and dedication. And this is an extraordinary event, just highlighting what we're just starting with the Maryland Campaign. Today, you will hear among 3 incredible historians the story of Special Orders 191 and its significance. But this would not have happened without the tremendous help and effort of a lot of folks. And I'd like to single out Liz Chateau, Heart of Civil War Heritage Director and the Frederick Historic Sites Consortium Coordinator, and of course John Fiedler, Executive Director of Tourism Council of Frederick County. And we are very fortunate today to have descendants of the soldiers who found the Special Orders. And I would like to bring up Park Ranger Tracy Evans, whose dedication for more than 2 years to make the exhibit happen and the companion events is extraordinary. And she will tell you the story of the descendants. Tracy.
Hello, good afternoon, everybody. Glad you're all able to get in here and get a seat. I am, as many of you know, a ranger at Manassas National Battlefield, and we've been working on this project for a while, and I've been fortunate enough to be in contact with the families of John McKnight Bloss and Barton Mitchell, mostly because you guys contacted me, so thank you very much. And I'm so glad that you all are able to be a part of the events, both yesterday and today, and have loaned us artifacts that are part of the exhibit, which is just wonderful. While we're all here, we would like to sort of recognize you all. If I could have the members of the John McKnight Bloss family stand. And members of the Barton Mitchell family. A couple back here. And I would also like to mention that today is John McKnight Bloss, not himself, but the grandson, who I believe he likes to be called Jack. Today is his 81st birthday. So. And for those of you who may not know the names that I'm speaking right now, John McKnight Bloss and Barton Mitchell, they were 2 of the very important folks who were in Company F of 27th Indiana, who were instrumental in finding the lost orders and making sure that it got to who it needed to get to, that being McClellan. So it's very important, and we are very happy to have them with us here today. So with that, I'm going to introduce John Fiedler, who is the Executive Director of Tourism Council of Frederick, and he is going to be the moderator of our panel today.
Thank you, Tracy and Ray, and congratulations to your entire team at Manassas National Battlefield. Here at the Tourism Council of Frederick County, I'll admit we're proud of this facility, but it wouldn't be worth a hill of beans if it weren't for all the great partners and great sites that we have from one end of this county to the other. And Manassas is certainly a shining example. And what an exciting time right now with Special Order 191 for the first time back to where it was written 150 years ago. thank you all for turning out, for those of you in the room here, because some folks can hear me out there that aren't in the room, but congratulations for getting here early for a great panel. I don't want to assume that everybody knows the basic story of 191. You might have seen the little clip before we started, but I thought the Park Service did a nice little couple sentence recap of it, so just in case you needed a refresher on it, Confederate General Robert E. Lee issued Special Orders 191 on September 9th, 1862, while his army camped on the Best Farm, where 2 years later the Battle of Manassas would be fought, and the reason we have that land protected today here just south of Frederick. Lee ordered his generals to divide the Army of Northern Virginia into 4 sections. Pretty bold move given the fact that he was in enemy territory when he made that decision. Union General George B. McClellan was unable to determine Lee's plan or movements prior to September the 13th, when Union soldiers discovered, the soldiers that you just heard about, an envelope containing 2 cigars and a copy of Special Orders 191. With the orders in front of him, McClellan ordered the Army of the Potomac to move more quickly than Lee had anticipated and forced Lee to make a desperate stand at the battles of South Mountain on September 14th and 3 days later, the Battle of Antietam. You have probably heard this quote from Union General George B. McClellan upon having that paper in hand. "Here is a paper with which, if I cannot whip Bobby Lee, I will be willing to go home." So there you have it. We are going to hear from 3 gentlemen, each in their own right would be worth coming out today just to hear one of them. We have 3 of them who can really enlighten us more on this topic, and I am pleased and privileged to introduce them. We'll call them up as I introduce them. Denis Frey, Chief Historian at Harpers Ferry National Historical Park. He is a lecturer, guide, and prominent Civil War historian. Denis has had numerous appearances on public television, the History Channel, the Discovery Channel, and A&E as a guest historian. And if you were here a little bit earlier today, he was doing a book tour wearing his other hat as a private author, and C-SPAN was here recording that for future broadcast. He's co-founder and first president of the Save Historic Antietam Foundation, and co-founder and former president of what is today the Civil War Trust, where he helped save battlefields in a dozen states. Denis's 8th book is the one he was talking about today, September Suspense, Lincoln's Union in Peril. Not long ago, he came out with Harper's Ferry Under Fire, all coinciding, of course, with the sesquicentennial. Please welcome Denis Frey.
Thank you.
Dr. Thomas G. Clemens recently retired as a professor of history at Hagerstown Community College. Tom has become one of the foremost historians on the Maryland Campaign of 1862, having just edited and annotated a 2-volume edition of the manuscript of Ezra Carman. Tom has been featured in numerous Civil War documentaries as well as programs on the History Channel and C-SPAN, and is a regular contributor to several military and history magazines. Tom is also a longtime activist for battlefield preservation, founder and member of the board of Save Historic Antietam Foundation, which has saved several structures as well as hundreds of acres of land around the Antietam battlefield. Welcome, Tom Clemens. And Dr. Mark Snell is Associate Professor of History and Director of the George Tyler Moore Center for the Study of the Civil War. He's retired from the United States Army and former Assistant Professor at the United States Military Academy at West Point. He's written or edited several books on the Civil War, including From First to Last, The Life of Major General William B. Franklin. During the fall semester of 2008, Mark served as visiting senior lecturer of war studies at the Royal Military Academy at Stanhurst in the United Kingdom. In February 2009, he was given the Honorary West Virginian Award by Governor Joe Manchin, which is the highest award the governor can bestow on someone who is not a West Virginia citizen, equivalent to knighthood in many areas. Please, Mark Snell from Shepherd University. These gentlemen have not really compared notes. I know that over the years they have had occasion to hear each other present, but this is going to be interesting to be focused on one topic that is still debated to this day. 150 years later, what was the significance of the finding of 191? The significance of the decision to split the Army in the first place, the significance of McClellan getting a copy of that. So we're going to get their take on each of it, but this is really a dialogue, and so we invite you to participate. As you entered, you had a chance to submit questions. We do have a number of them, but as thoughts are prompted through the discussion today, we will also take them on the spot from the floor, so be prepared. We have a full house today here. The microphones in front of these gentlemen are actually for recording purposes, because this is being recorded by the great folks at the City of Frederick Video Department. So they are not on a PA mic. I know they can all belt it out in front of a crowd on a battlefield, so we're not worried about that. But please wave your hand in the back if you can't hear them too well. If we have to, we'll bring them up here to the podium. But we're going to try it right from the table. Again, please welcome all three of our panelists. So we decided, since we want this to be a dialogue, we want to get the questions out there and get their different thoughts on it, that we would start with just the briefest of opening comments, and we'll do it in reverse order. So we'll give them each like a minute to do their opening comment, just as if this was a political debate. And then we will jump right into the questions. So please, and we'll give them each a crack at the different questions as they come up. So again, any thoughts you have, be prepared to ask questions, but we have some ready to go. And so Mark, why don't we start with you with just some opening thoughts on this subject?
Okay, just right up front, I'm feeling under the weather, so I'm not going to be as vociferous and bellicose as I normally am with these two guys. The finding of the lost orders is one of the turning points of the American Civil War. And what George McClellan and his staff did with that on that day was absolutely militarily remarkable. To take information and to verify it as being real, to take these orders wrapped around cigars, send it up the chain of command, which is not easy to do. Trust me on that. Have it verified, and then have a staff put together a response to that information and getting it out to the various commanders in the field, which are spread apart by what, 20 miles? And then having that response re-verified was, to me, one of the most brilliant military moves by a commander in the war. Now, that's going to raise some eyebrows, I'm sure, because there's a lot of McClellan, what's the word I'm looking for?
Be nice, just be nice.
Bashers, yeah. I think on this case, on that day, what he did was remarkable. So, that's my 1 minute.
Thank you. Tom?
I was glad to see you include the quote from John Gibbon about here's a paper with which, if I cannot whip Bobby Lead, I will go home. Because in the next 4 days after receiving that paper, McClellan will move his Army of the Potomac nearly 20 miles, drive Lee from 2 battlefields, forcing him to retire at night after one of them, and capture 39 colors, 13 cannons, 15,000 small arms, 6,000 prisoners, losing none. That, by any reasonable definition, is a whipping.
All right, thank you. And Denis?
I don't understand how I get trapped between these two people. But
Thorn between two roses.
I suspect that many of you probably have this in your collections, and I brought it as an artifact, but I wanted to show it to you. This is one of the books on the campaign called The Gleam of Bayonets. How many of you have this in your collection, your personal collection? The Gleam of Bayonets by James Murphy. Not as many as I would suspect, actually. This book was published in 1964. It was the campaign history of the Centennial for the Battle of Antietam. And I knew Jim very well. Jim was a Washington County boy where I grew out in the Clear Spring area. Worked for the National Park Service for his career. In fact, I knew him so well that when he passed away, I was asked by his wife to represent the Park Service and eulogize him as the Park Service representative at his funeral. But you heard 2 different points of view, and I thought that perhaps instead of sharing my own at this point, I might share Jim Murphy's point of view. Now, this book has sold tens and tens and tens of thousands of copies, something that Mark and Tom and I can only aspire to do. And this is what he had to say about McClellan. McClellan, and then 191, McClellan had, and I quote, the grandest opportunity of his military career. how he squandered away precious time is a matter of military history and one of the saddest moments of the war for the Union.
Well, there we have our opening volleys. So with that, as I said, we have some questions. We'll do a couple of the ones that were prepared ahead of time and submitted, and then open it up and see if we want to jump in. At this point, I'm thinking I will just throw it out there because I know we have three fine gentlemen here who will figure out how to share the stage. So whoever wants to tackle it first, start talking first, and we'll give you each a chance. This question is, with the Union Army in such disarray after Second Manassas, why did Lee spend so much time at Frederick and not venture further north?
Well, let me start. I think that's very simple. One is that his army was tired, it was fatigued, it was straggling, and Lee needed rest. His men needed rest. He also needed time to reorganize. You have to understand that in the campaigns from Richmond through Manassas, his officer corps has been decimated. And I'm not speaking so much about general officers, but men who are the leaders of the men in the field, from colonel right on down through non-commissioned officers. He has had enormous fatalities. And so the leadership is limited. He's looking for replacements. He's not quite certain who those people are. So a pause at Frederick gives him not only a chance to take a breath, but also an opportunity to try to reorganize the army. And finally, I would say that Frederick was the ideal position for him to stay for a long time. Long time. I mean, he, at Frederick, threatens Washington. Now, you have to remember that they don't know what Lee is doing in Washington. Unlike us, where we know what happens, they don't know what's about to happen. And so let's not fast forward, let's do it in real time. They don't know what Lee's plans are, and they don't know that he won't be attacking Washington. After all, the rebels have been trying to defend Richmond for the last year and a half, so it only would make sense that the rebels now would assault Washington. They don't know that's not Lee's intention. More so, Baltimore is in his sights. Baltimore is a rich target, and it is an easy target, basically undefended with almost no defenses and no soldiers, with the railroad just waiting as bait for the Confederate Army. And so from Frederick, he can move towards Washington, he can move towards Baltimore, 2-day march, he's in Baltimore, or on 1 day's march, he's across the Mason-Dixon line at Gettysburg in 1862. You all know how important Gettysburg was the next year. It was just as important in 1862. All those roads that were there in 63 were there in 62, and Lee could use any one of those roads to go wherever he wanted to in Quakerland. So Frederick was the ideal launch pad for the campaign. If you're Robert E. Lee, the Yankees are frozen, they don't know what he's going to do, and he's got the opportunity to maneuver and threaten major metropolitan areas or go into Pennsylvania.
I wouldn't disagree necessarily with that, and I think we're very fortunate that we have Lee's nearly daily letters to his commander-in-chief, Jefferson Davis. And in those letters, Lee, I think, reveals an awful lot of what his strategy in this campaign was. He cannot stay in Northern Virginia, where he has just defeated Pope's army. There's just not enough food in the region to support him or the army that he's with or the thousands of horses that move that army. So he's moving to an area where he can sustain and feed the army and threaten Washington. But he tells Davis in those letters that it is his intention to move to Hagerstown or beyond, and that what he hopes to do is lure a Union army out of Washington. As Denis says, the Lincoln administration cannot tolerate a Confederate army occupying Maryland for any length of time. They've got to do something. Lee understands that. And what he hopes, as he expresses in these letters to his commander, is that he will lure this Union army westward, over the Catoctons, over South Mountain, out into the Cumberland Valley, the great valley there between Hagerstown and Chambersburg, and on ground of his choosing, he intends to turn and attack that Union army and defeat it. And by inflicting yet another disastrous defeat on a Union army, this may provide the morale blow to the Northern public that will cause them, a couple of months later in November, to go to the polls and vote a peace Congress into power that would negotiate independence with the Union and Confederacy being two separate nations. In other words, in short, Lee hopes to gain nothing but complete victory in the war somewhere in western Maryland, perhaps southern Pennsylvania, in September of 1862. And he stays at Frederick, sort of pressuring the Union, daring them to bring that army out to chase him so that he can move on and lure them to where he wants to attack them.
I think his army was just worn out and it needed a rest, as you said. I mean, this is an army that only, 2 months before had gone through the 7 days battles. July 1st, you mentioned about the loss of so many officers. July 1st at Malvern Hill, every brigade and regimental commander who attacked Malvern Hill was killed or wounded. Plus, he had to reorganize his army. He had to get rid of generals that didn't do well during the 7 days. People like Theophilus Holmes. Don't you like names like that? Theophilus?
Isn't that what you named your firstborn?
No. This guy's such a comedian, isn't he? Benjamin Huger, John Magruder. Then he's going to take his army and take it from the peninsula up to the old Manassas battlefield and defeat a separate Union army, the Army of Virginia under Pope, with attachments from the Army of the Potomac. And then within a week and a half after that, cross the Potomac River, a major obstacle, enter enemy territory. I think he just pushed and pushed and pushed his soldiers so hard, they had to stop. They had to wait.
Great. Thank you all. And I would note from the tourism perspective, we always encourage visitors to linger in Frederick. Any recognized currency or credit card is accepted. Confederate script, some of the merchants weren't too keen on, but a question that was submitted this afternoon, and I think you've already touched on it from the standpoint of them lingering in Frederick, but it's sort of a follow-up, was the fact that so many Confederate generals were injured, have any impact on the rest of the campaign, as well as why they lingered in Frederick?
Well, physically, you've got Jackson being thrown by a horse that was presented to him on entering Maryland, and so for several days, Jackson's going to be a little ouchy and stiff and sore. In fact, he turns command of his, his portion of the army over to D.H. Hill for a day as he's recovering from that. So certainly he's not in his best of physical conditions. Longstreet, somewhere during the campaign, develops a fairly substantial blister on one of his feet and has to, instead of wearing his general's boots, is wearing carpet slippers. And I'm sure that limited his mobility a little bit. I think the biggest injury that I can imagine is to Robert E. Lee himself. That on August 31st, there's a lot of different variations of the story, who knows, but somehow or another he was standing on the ground, had wrapped the reins of the horse that he was holding around his forearm. Somebody came by, flapped a poncho or did something that spooked the horse, pulled him off his feet. He went forward onto his hands and broke bones in his right hand and had strained ligaments, tendons in both hands. And so from August 31st until mid-October, his hands are bandaged and splinted and in slings for most of the campaign. He's riding in an ambulance. Members of his staff have to dress him and feed him. And I think most importantly, for the impact of what our topic is today, 191, Lee normally would have written that order himself, as he did with most important orders, but because of his injuries, he couldn't. And because Walter Taylor, who would normally do that sort of thing, was elsewhere, he picks Robert Chilton to write the order, and that's critical because it is Chilton's handwriting that the Union officer, Samuel Pittman, recognizes to authenticate the order. So there's a huge quirk of these injuries that affects 191.
And I'll simply say that Robert E. Lee is 55 years old in this campaign, and I used to think 55 was really old. So it takes a little longer to heal. That's my point.
Yeah. I know what you're talking about.
Mark, anything to add to that?
Well, Denis is older than me. No, but you can imagine, being in command and having some sort of an illness or malady. Lee having his arms in splints and having to make these momentous decisions. Just unbelievable. But as Tom pointed out, it's absolutely right. Lee would have normally written this out, and he had a staff officer write it out. And that staff officer's handwriting was recognized, which allowed McClellan to do that remarkable thing on September 13th and get his army moving.
All right, thank you. At this point, let's see if we have any questions yet from anybody in the audience here. Anybody? Don't be bashful. In the back there, sir.
Well, you can excoriate McClellan all you want for his version of exercising Napoleonic tactics there in Antietam, but in the core fact is he did enough for Lincoln to raise the stakes and issue the Emancipation Proclamation. So really, that was all he really needed to do to, I think, shift the balance advantage in the direction for the Union Army.
Well, that wasn't his assignment. The president didn't say to McClellan, go out there and beat the rebels so I can issue the Emancipation Proclamation. The president's assignment was, you save Washington, you protect the Capitol, you protect Baltimore, and then you go chase that rebel and you get them, you keep them out of Pennsylvania, or if they get up there, you make sure they leave Pennsylvania. So the political consequence is dramatic for Lincoln and the Republicans. But Lincoln was on a timetable. Many of you don't realize this perhaps, but on July the 22nd, we'll talk 60 days for a moment. On July the 22nd, the president issued a proclamation of sorts. It was what we would today call an executive order on July the 22nd. And in essence, what that does is that promulgates the law of the land as passed by the Congress, which was called the Second Confiscation Act. And on July the 22nd, what the president basically is saying is, if you people, meaning the rebels, if you people don't end your rebellion, I will issue a proclamation of emancipation 60 days henceforth. And so he was giving the Confederates the opportunity to stop, and then they would be able to keep their property. The Confiscation Act was all designed to take property, and of course enslaved people weren't people, they were property. And so the blow was to strike property. And so sure enough, on September the 22nd, which is exactly 60 days after Lincoln issued his warning, he issues his Emancipation Proclamation.
Can I jump in? Sure. A couple myths about the Maryland campaign and McClellan's performance in it. One I've already talked about is that he was slow once he received a copy of the lost orders, okay? That
He wasn't?
No, he wasn't slow. He absolutely was not slow. I met with a group of general officers from the United States Army a couple of years ago on a Maryland campaign staff ride. And I said to the general, I said, once you receive information, how long does it take you to disseminate it, come up with a plan, and issue that to all your commanders in the field, and then have them verify it? And he looked at his chief of staff, and the chief of staff said, God, I don't know. And he said, what, a week? Maybe? McClellan does this in a couple of hours. Okay, so I think that's one myth. The second myth, I think, is that Antietam is seen as a tactical draw, that the armies just pounded each other on September 17th and woke up on the 18th and looked at each other, and Lee just decided, I've had enough, I'm going back into Virginia, actually now West Virginia. Anytime you inflict a higher casualty of losses on your opponent than you sustain, and they leave the field, that's a win. It's not a tactical draw. I don't know where that came up from. I don't know how that started.
I think if you look in the South, you'll find out.
I think the Union forces suffered 12,000 some odd casualties. The Confederates suffered 10,000 some odd casualties. However, the Union attacked the whole day, and an attacking force, is going to sustain more casualties. If you look at Gettysburg the following year. And like Gettysburg, Lee decided to leave the field and retreat back into Virginia. Now, the third myth is McClellan didn't follow up. Well, he did follow up. He followed up with a divisional assault on September 19th and 20th at Shepherdstown, and it was repulsed with casualties of close to 700 on both sides. With that, the campaign pretty much comes to an end. But we just get into this rut where we don't give McClellan the credit that he probably is due. And remember, he's commanding a new army at the time. He's commanding the Army of Virginia and the Army of the Potomac combined, with lots of new regiments coming into the fold and lots of new generals. So he's having to do a lot of patching up and then find an enemy and fix that enemy and defeat that enemy, and he does.
I think it's interesting that the first week of September, when basically there were no generals in charge of any army anywhere here in the East, McClellan's on a shelf because Lincoln put him there. Pope is in disgrace because Pope put himself in disgrace. And we have nobody in charge of any army. And I'll just say one thing with respect to Mark's point about bringing an army together. I would actually suggest that McClellan is putting together 4 new armies. He's got his old army, the Army of the Potomac, which he will come back to. The Army of Virginia, which he never commanded, Pope's army, he will now take command of. He's not worked with these people before. He's got Burnside joining him with Burnside's army. Now, he and Burnside are very close friends, but they haven't fought together because Burnside's been elsewhere. This will be the first time they will fight together. And finally, you've got 60,000 new recruits. The president, you might recall, in the summer of 1862 has made a plea to the men of the United States to join the army. I need 300,000 men now, right now. And then he makes another plea a month later for another 300,000. So actually, during the summer of 1862, he calls for 600,000 men to squash the rebellion. Well, men are responding. Tens of thousands of them are responding. And the last week of August, first week of September, many of them are arriving in Washington. They've got no boot camp. They've had their uniform on for a week or 2 or 3 at most. Their flag's not stained, and they've never fired their weapons, certainly not at the enemy. And so McClellan is taking those people, these brand new people, and trying to incorporate them into his army as well. So you've got, it's an incredible thing to take 4 different programs, really, or operations, and trying to unify it during an emergency. This is an emergency. This is an invasion. The capital is jeopardized. Baltimore is seriously in harm. Pennsylvania is freaked out. And they are convinced in Pennsylvania that Lee's not stopping in Maryland. He's going to Philadelphia. If you don't believe it, you take a look at their own words in here, which they say over and again, that Philadelphia, according to the Yankees that are writing about this, not the Yankees who know, but the Yankees who don't know, they're all scared to death that Lee's going to Philadelphia. That is not out of reason, because there's no federal army between Philadelphia and Robert E. Lee.
If I can tag back to your point, I think you're kind of getting into the relationship between McClellan and President Lincoln, which is a very difficult and, in my view, I think unworkable relationship ultimately. I think you have 2 people who are very brilliant in their own fields. McClellan certainly had a reputation as one of the most brilliant and accomplished men in the Army when he left it in 1857 to go into the railroading business, which was the glamour business of that era. Lincoln probably is the most skilled politician ever to hold the office of presidency. And I don't say politician in a pejorative sense, because I believe it is an art, and I believe Lincoln is an absolute artist in that field, at mustering people to see his point of view and get things done his way, even though he's got a lot of enemies. The problem is these two brilliant men talk past each other and don't really respect each other. And it's not a good relationship for a president and a general in command of the armies. As Denis pointed out, McClellan really was in an ambiguous position on September 1st. On September 2nd, Lincoln and Halleck visit him and say, we want you to be in command of the defenses of the capital because they're concerned that Lee is going to strike Washington. And so McClellan begins to place all of these various troops from a lot of different places, as Denis outlined, to defend the capital. On September 3rd, McClellan receives an order telling him to organize a field army to take the field. Now, the September 2nd order from Lincoln caused so much controversy that his Secretary of War, Edwin Stanton, refused for that order to go out under his signature. And in fact, it goes out under his assistant adjutant general named Townsend. And in fact, two members of Lincoln's cabinet are quoted by a third cabinet member as saying they would rather see the rebels take Washington than McClellan be in command of the army. And people smile and nod and say, well, there you go, McClellan's a lousy general. That's not why they're saying it. How many teams that are facing tall odds will say, let's just not even go out of the locker room, let's forfeit the game? You don't. So they're not saying McClellan's a bad general. What they're saying is they're afraid he's going to win. If he saves the capital, saves the country, and defeats and destroys Lee's army, who's going to be the next president? The conservative Democrat George McClellan, and not Lincoln and the radical Republicans. So do you know why the radical Republicans are very ambiguous about McClellan? Of course. Gee, politics would creep its way into the military, Mark?
I wouldn't know.
So when he's told to organize the field army on the 3rd, he knows that there are people in the cabinet who are essentially sharpening knives, waiting to plunge them into his back. He asks who's going to command the field army, and he's told, we haven't decided. And of course, as we know, that command is offered to Burnside, who turns it down and says, I'm incompetent to command such a large force. The man you want is McClellan. It is also offered to Ethan Allen Hitchcock, or at least Ethan Allen Hitchcock says so. And so they're shopping around. He puts together the field army, begins to position it outside the defenses. On September 5th, the president and Halleck, again, commander-in-chief of the whole country and the commander of all the armies in the field, leapfrogging the Secretary of War. These two men come to McClellan again and say, take the field army and go out. Your missions are, as Denis said, protect Washington and Baltimore, drive the Confederates out of Maryland. And of course, once he gets to Frederick, Washington and Baltimore are pretty much safe. Now, what's interesting about that September 5th order is it is never put in writing. You won't find it in the compiled official records of the war. You won't find it in the McClellan papers or in the Lincoln papers or anyplace else. It was never written down. And interestingly enough, not long afterward, when both Halleck and Lincoln are questioned about why they would restore McClellan to command, both of them, because they're not together, will blame the other one for doing it. Now, for those of us that have been around the world more than once or twice, what does that tell you as a commander of the army about the confidence you have of the commander-in-chief, and who's going to have your back if things don't go well?
Yeah.
Nobody. And so we wonder why McClellan fights this campaign somewhat conservatively. And I would even argue that perhaps he doesn't do that, in that he believes, and we'll probably get into that, I'm sure, sooner or later, that he is outnumbered, and yet he pursues and attacks Lee's army 3 times. South Mountain, Antietam, Shepherdstown Fort.
I'd like to ask the group a question. Why did General Lee issue Special Orders 191? What was it really all about? Correct. That's it. If you didn't hear what he said, the answer is reduce Harper's Ferry. That's what it's all about. And that often gets lost in the lost order, is the significance of what it really was intended to do. And so as you remember that it gets lost, I think one of the most fascinating things about Special Orders 191 is that it works. It worked. Yes, Lee succeeded. Jackson succeeded as they laid it out. It worked. And that makes it one of the most remarkable military accomplishments of Lee and Jackson's military careers. In fact, I would argue that no other time during the war does Jackson face such obstacles, especially natural obstacles, as he does at Harper's Ferry. I suspect almost all of you have been there. The place is an obstacle. And then to be ordered to take it, and to take those obstacles is really quite extraordinary. And so just keep in mind that although this thing gets lost, and it certainly does create havoc for General Lee, it still works. Jackson succeeds in what I consider to be Jackson's most remarkable military feat of the war.
We have another question from the floor, back here.
You colleagues, because we know each other, I have introduced all kinds of interesting questions to raise, and I would put one quick plug in for what I consider a pivotal moment, and it's right down Route 85 in Frederick County. The Thanksgiving Farm is a marker that talks about the horse that Jackson has given. And to me, you can, as well as the green corn, and you can write off anything other than green corn and horses as causing the events as they occur in Maryland. But that's another question. What I'm more interested in, and this is what Mark, of course, is working on, and Dennis, you raised the Harper's Ferry issue. The performance is only as good as your subordinates make it. And I'm interested in hearing your views on the next echelon down. You've written on William B. Franklin, the allusion to Jackson's campaign against Dixon. Miles, come on, let's be serious.
I am, Frank. Miles held on for 3 days. That's not too bad.
The fascination with that next echelon and their performance of corps, division, that sort of thing. Would you all comment on that? In implementation of this question of the Special Orders 191.
I'll let you take
Which
Franklin.
army? Both armies?
Take each army.
Oh.
I'll let you take Franklin. Let me just, I'll do Burnside. I mean, because certainly we could all stand up here and stomp on Burnside and have a joyous time. Just smashing the reputation of Burnside. Burnside was extraordinary in this campaign. Yes. Who was the only man in an army of almost 90,000, other than McClellan, who had commanded an army? Burnside. It's the only man. Who was the man when he arrived in Washington, and McClellan was placed in command? Who was the man who protected Baltimore? Burnside. Who was given basically independent command to move north to protect Baltimore, independent from McClellan, in that he was not with McClellan and not under McClellan's immediate jurisdiction. Burnside. Who was the first to drive into Frederick with his command? Burnside. Who was the first to attack South Mountain at McClellan's direction? Burnside. And everywhere, every one of these points, he succeeded. He protects Baltimore. We can't forget that. You can't just assume that Baltimore wouldn't be protected. They do it physically on the ground. They move into position. Burnside does that. They take Frederick. Burnside does. They attack South Mountain. That's Burnside's men, except down at the southern end. And then the assignment that McClellan gives Burnside after South Mountain is a very important one. Burnside is given the assignment to go to Harper's Ferry and help Franklin save the Harper's Ferry garrison because Harper's Ferry hadn't surrendered yet. That was the pivotal person he was sending south to finish that campaign off in favor of the Federals. In the meantime, the white flags went up, and that canceled that out. But before that, Burnside was going to help Franklin. And so I think Burnside did an exceptional job until you get to September the 17th. And on September the 17th, which is not our topic today, he also did an exceptional job. How do I know that? The numbers speak for themselves. There are 23,000 casualties in 12 hours at Sharpsburg. In front of the bridge, where the great myth is that Burnside pounds the bridge over and over and over again because he's an idiot. Total Union casualties, 400. He went around the bridge. So I think Burnside had an extraordinary campaign.
I think you give too much credit to Burnside for September 17th, though.
Talk about your guy, Franklin. I didn't say anything about General Franklin at Crampton's Gap, so let's talk about
A fellow by the name of Jacob Cox, I think, needs to get some credit for September 17th. Wouldn't you say that, Tom?
Well, you know, Cox is certainly there. He's technically in command of the Corps, but, you know, what exactly was decided by Cox and what's decided by Burnside is known really to those two men. So Burnside is certainly handing much of the tactical control in Ninth Corps to Cox, but, you know, was it Cox that ordered Rodman's division downstream, or was it Burnside who told Cox to do it? So there's another mystery there that, you know, we'll probably not know, just like we'll not know exactly where 191's found.
Right.
But go ahead and talk about Franklin, if you like.
I think we're starting to lose the normal people in here.
Are there any normal people in here?
A little too much detail.
Let's mix the questions up so we don't have the same person asking questions. So if there's anybody else that has questions.
Anybody else from the floor right now?
Because we can certainly ask ourselves questions.
There's one right there.
The chronology of finding the orders and moving them up the ladder of command.
Well, that's an interesting topic, too. There's a lot of discussion, and actually there's somebody who's not up here on the panel who probably should be when we talk about that, and that would be Tracy, who has looked into more of this detail than I think probably the three of us. But Colgrove, I believe, the colonel, the 27th, argues that it's fairly early in the morning, 9:30, 10 o'clock, he says. But Ezra Carman, since we're plugging our own books,
You two are. This is not my
Ezra
book.
Carman, who was commanding a regiment in the same division that Colgrove was in, he was there. When he writes about this in his manuscript of the whole Maryland campaign, he says that it's his memory that it was closer to noon. So there you go. Somewhere no earlier than 9:30, perhaps closer to noon. That it's passed through the regiment fairly quickly from Mitchell and Bloss to Captain Kopp to Colonel Colgrove. And from Colgrove it goes to the headquarters of Williams. Williams was at that point commanding not only the 1st Division of 12th Corps, and it actually wasn't even 12th Corps yet. They're still calling it Banks's Old Corps or 2nd Corps Army of Virginia under Pope, but we know it as the 12th Corps. Williams was commanding the Corps. It had been Banks's. Banks is left behind in the defenses, so he's commanding his own division and the Corps. It gets to his headquarters fairly quickly. Again, there's a lot of discussion about that. Carman, as a historian, was, I think, very interested in getting to the details.
Tom, why don't you tell everybody who Carman was?
I'm sorry. He was appointed in 1894 to be and his title literally was historical expert on the Antietam Battlefield Board, which was the board overseeing laying out the battlefield and trying to sort out who shot at who, where, and where all the monuments and things should go. And he wrote an 1,800-page handwritten manuscript of the entire campaign, delving into all sorts of nuances like the lost order and other things. And so when he wanted to find out about the sequence, he wrote letters to his friend Samuel Pittman. Pittman was the staff officer in Williams's headquarters who looked at lost order and said, that's Robert Chilton's handwriting, I'd recognize it anywhere. And so Carman wanted to get to the story. He goes right to the horse's mouth. He knew Pittman. Pittman had been a staff officer in the division where Carman commanded a regiment. They became quite familiar over the years. And Pittman gives Carman his whole memory of what happened based on letters that he sent home at the time, which he had saved. And so he makes it clear that this went up the chain fairly quickly, that it is clearly in McClellan's hands, if not by noon, sometime shortly after. And there's some key phrases that McClellan will use. I think when he sends the telegraph to President Lincoln, he says, came into my hands this evening, which in 19th century parlance could mean any time after noon. But certainly it does go up the chain fairly quickly. And as Mark pointed out earlier, the whole process of verification is another story, but I've talked long enough. I'll let the other two talk.
We have, if I may, with the permission of the Bloss family, this is a letter that one of the founders of Lost Order 191 wrote on September the 25th. And this is on display. The original letter is on display at the Manassas Battlefield Visitor Center. I saw it yesterday. And Tracy transcribed it. And this is really a remarkable letter. It really is. Because probably this is the very first acknowledgement of the discovery of Special Orders 191. This letter hasn't been published, incidentally. So you're hearing it publicly for the first time, and you can see it publicly at the Manassas Battlefield thanks to the generosity of the family. But I was stunned when I read this. Again, this is September 25th, so it is only 12 days after the actual finding of the order. And this is what he says. No, I don't need those. This is what he says. He says, Corporal Mitchell, who was his aide or his assistant, or who was with him actually, Corporal Mitchell was very fortunate at Frederick. He found General Lee's plan of attack on Maryland and what each division of his army was to do. I was with him when he found it and read it first. Now that's fascinating. I'm not quite sure what he means there. There could be a double meaning to that sentence. I was with him when he found it and read it first. So does that mean that Corporal Mitchell is reading it first and he's there? Or does that mean that Corporal Mitchell has found the order and the very first person who's reading it is Bloss? Interesting. I don't know which way that goes. I saw its importance. He said, I seen its importance. Is that the way y'all speak out there in Indiana? I seen its importance and took it to the colonel, which Tom was just describing. He immediately took it to General Gordon, which means it's going up the ranks quickly. That'd be General George Gordon. And he said, and I love this, and I bet you this is exactly what Gordon said, because I can't imagine this sergeant in the field who's been wounded incidentally in Antietam, who's recovering in a barn hospital. I'm sure he probably didn't make this up. When General Gordon received the order, he said, and I quote, "It was worth a mint of money." That is a wonderful descriptor, worth a mint of money. And he sent it to General McClellan. So, we don't know, of course, he doesn't have any idea what happened to it once it left his hand, but he seems pretty certain about it here as he writes, that it got to McClellan pretty quickly. So thank you all for sharing this with us, because this is an incredible piece of history. It's remarkable. Something none of us have seen. We've been studying this collectively for over 100 years up here, probably close to 150 years with our collective interest in this campaign. And this is new. And so it's really quite a remarkable piece of literature.
And introduces some ambiguity, because Colgrove and Pittman are certain that it went to Williams, and yet he's saying it went to Gordon.
Right.
But as I like to say about the Civil War, all those guys with a beard look alike anyway.
Right up here, sir.
Does anyone ever think that this order was deception? Planted deception?
Then or now?
Whatever.
Did everybody hear the question? Does anyone think that the order may have been planted deception?
Planted deception.
Well, certainly, of course. I mean, that would have to enter into any rational person's understanding of this as, okay, it's been found, the signature's been verified as genuine, but is it something we were meant to find? A ruse de guerre, as they would refer to that at the time, a trick of war. And again, Mark can speak to this perhaps more directly than I can, but it is standard operating procedure in the military then as well as now, that when you intercept enemy intelligence, you verify it by a separate and independent source before you act on it. I mean, even in World War II, when we're reading Japanese naval code, reading German, Enigma machines, we never acted on it until we could verify it from another source. Because if you do, particularly in later wars, you're giving away that you know something about their identity. I think it's very much in flux. And so what happened was, when this order was written, it is dividing the army into 4 parts, and up until this division, D.H. Hill's division had been operating under Jackson's authority. D.H. Hill, in an article in a magazine called The Land We Love in 1868, speaks to this very directly and says, I was getting all my orders through Jackson's headquarters. I was under Jackson. Well, this order separates him from Jackson. Jackson's going to Harper's Ferry. D.H. Hill's going to Boonesboro. And so when the orders were written, it became logical at Army headquarters under Lee that all of the three commanders going to various parts of Harper's Ferry would get a copy of the orders: Jackson, McLaws, and Walker. That Longstreet would get a copy because he has a command, he's going elsewhere. D.H. Hill, now separated to be the rear guard, got a copy from Lee's headquarters, or was supposed to. But Jackson, again, there's no email, you can't look at the CC and see who got all these. Jackson gets this order, sees that D.H. Hill is no longer under his authority. He writes a copy of it himself in his own handwriting, sends that to D.H. Hill. D.H. Hill got that, and when after the war he is accused of losing it, he is very vehement. He said, I got it right here, it's in my papers, handwritten from Jackson. I didn't lose anything. But it is the Lee copy to D.H. Hill which is lost. And again, there's no agreement or concrete proof. Did Hill get 2 copies, discard 1? Did he never get the Lee copy and not receiving it didn't bother him because he got one from Jackson where he should have gotten it from in his mind? It's another one of those mysteries of this lost order that, again, I encourage you to write a novel on.
And again, for anyone who didn't hear the original question, this is addressing if it was ever figured out whose copy didn't get delivered, or did it get delivered and lost or whatever. Did either one of you had any?
And the answer is yes, it was the copy from Lee to D.H. Hill that would become the lost orders. But Hill was exactly where he was supposed to be, at exactly the right place, and that's because he had received orders, but they were Jackson's copied orders rather than the original orders from Lee's headquarters. And so Lee had no reason to believe anything was askew because everybody was exactly where they were supposed to be.
Sure. It's just sloppy staff work. It happens. It happens.
Isn't there a receipt sent back for each reception of an order?
We agree with Chilton's fault.
Yeah.
Tracy from the back.
Again, Chilton is questioned very thoroughly about this after the war, of course, right? And that's what he says is it was customary when important orders were being communicated that they were carried in an envelope, and this order's found in an envelope, and that whoever the order was sent to, that general would have to sign the envelope, and the couriers were to bring back the signed envelope to show that it had been delivered. Mm-hmm. And what Chilton says, and again, I'll be corrected by the other gentleman on the panel or Tracy, but Chilton says, all that stuff's gone. I can't go back and look at the envelopes now, but the fact that I didn't notice anything out of order, obviously, if he hadn't gotten back a signed envelope to him, that would have triggered in his mind that there was a problem. And he says, I don't remember any problem, so I assumed it had been delivered. Is that fair enough?
He said, an order that was that important should not have gone unnoticed, but obviously it did.
It did.
Mark or Dennis, anything to add on that?
One thing to add,
Okay.
as a serving college professor, as opposed to being a retired one,
I love it.
I'm looking at the audience and we're losing people now. So we could talk about this all day, but
We are wrapping up because we want to give them time to.
we
head on
got
down
some
to the
young people
battlefield.
here who have been absolutely wonderful. Trying to keep their eyes open, but
I would just, here's my final concluding statement, and that is that if you have a chance to take a look at Special Orders 191, not only is it an amazing piece of paper, but it's in amazing condition. And I saw that paper yesterday, which is 150 years, almost 150 years old, not shy a month or so. And I thought, this cannot be. So I want to finish with this question for you, because there are more questions about this than there will ever be answers, ever. And that's one of the wonderful things about history. When the day comes when we have all the answers to what occurred in history, all of us are a bunch of fools. So we don't know and never will know most of the answers. But I do think it's important and fun to pose this question. And the question is, how can something that was lost, that is paper, that was written in ink, that is water soluble, be on the ground in September of 1862, where every morning your feet get soaked just because of dew. You don't need rain. Yet this piece of paper, I just said you don't need rain, but you're right, it did. Yeah, we had rain on top of the dew. And so how can this piece of paper that should have been subjected to intense moisture look like it was just written on yesterday?
Providence.
Providence.
All right, with that, let's thank our panelists and thank all of you for attending. Denis Frey and Dr. Tom Clemens, thank you all for your insight today and for moving this along and having such a good discussion.